are going to do a bit of background on inference questions, and then we'll just do some examples like we usually do, work through them together and see if we can figure out some strategies that'll work for you. So let's get started. Here are some important considerations. Inference questions are a bit different than most of the question types we have encountered. A lot of critical reasoning questions are contingent on understanding assumptions that the author is making. So strengthen, weaken, evaluate the argument. All of those questions are very assumption-based. And that is most of the questions I think that you're going to run into on critical reasoning. These are a little bit less common, but they do still come up, and it is worth reviewing them. It's just that they require a slightly different strategy. The argument will not contain a conclusion. So technically, these are not arguments in the sense that they contain a conclusion, because they do not necessarily do so, but that will save us some time as far as looking for the conclusion. An inference must be fully supported, but it does not have to encapsulate the entire prompt. So we have different lessons in TTP about inference versus find the conclusion, and they are super similar. But if you were finding the main conclusion of an argument, it typically needs to encapsulate the whole prompt. Like, you should be able to tack it on at the end, and it kind of summarizes everything. An inference does not have to do that, but it does have to be fully supported. So it will be a conclusion, but it does not have to be a main conclusion. And unlike a lot of authors' conclusions, an inference must be true 100% of the time, whereas, as we all know, oftentimes author conclusions are a bit of a stretch. So those are some of the differences, the main one being that it must always be supported, and it might be based on the tiniest part of the passage. So don't get too bogged down in an inference having to summarize multiple premises. We are going to work through 6 examples, and you will get 2 minutes with each question, and then we will discuss the answers together. And please bring up any questions about the questions as we go through. We will also have some time at the end for questions. We're going to go ahead and get started. Here is your first example. I will give you 2 minutes. All right. Does anyone want some more time? Okay. There are a couple of things I would like to point out about this example, but we will read through it and then look at our breakdown, and I will describe some things that I think are worth noticing. Whenever demand for hotel rooms in Minnerton decreases, the rates that hotels charge decrease. Over the past 3 years, the availability of places to stay in Minnerton has increased since people renting out their apartments for short stays have increasingly provided hotel-type lodging to many of the travelers who otherwise would stay in hotels. Over the same period of time, rates charged by hotels have not changed. Which of the following can be properly inferred regarding the past 3 years from the statement above? Let's look at our breakdown. Whenever hotel room demand decreases, the rates charged by hotels decreases. So this is very basic supply and demand. One of the things I want to point out with these questions is that because you are not expected to have any information coming in, they will not necessarily, they might explain things that are kind of obvious. They have to do that. The other thing, and this isn't the worst offender, but there are some that are pretty bad about it, is that because the sentences have to be so clear and have to be so free from chances to misinterpret them, they will often be a bit clunky. So they might, instead of using pronouns for things, just repeat the noun in a way that no human would ever do so in conversation, because they want to make sure that there's no ambiguity that could be blamed for people missing the question. So that's why some of the verbal examples in particular are a little bit awkward in how they are phrased. Fact 2, the availability of places to stay in Minnerton has increased over the past 3 years. Fact 3, people renting out their apartments have increasingly provided hotel-style lodging to many travelers who otherwise would stay in hotels. This is kind of what I was talking about. They are trying to be very clear about how this is a fair substitution, that people see it as a substitution. So that is not a point of contention for the argument. And fact 4, over the same period of time, rates charged by hotels have not changed. Let's look at answers. Minnerton hotel operators' fears that short-term apartment rentals would hurt the hotel business were unfounded. This is not supported because we do not know the whole situation, and also this is not contained to the time period we are discussing. It is very reasonable that short-term apartment rentals might hurt the hotel business even if they haven't yet. So that the fears were unfounded is an overstatement. B, there have been more empty hotel rooms in Minnerton over the past 3 years than in previous years. So this kind of contradicts the passage, because if there were more empty hotel rooms, that would sort of go hand in hand with demand for hotel rooms had decreased. And in that case, the price should have gone down. C, overall traveler demand for lodging in Minnerton has increased. Yeah, it would just about have to, because there has been an increase in supply in the market because people are renting out their apartments, and yet the rates have not decreased. So the overall traveler demand for lodging in Minnerton must have increased if the increased supply did not lead to a decrease in prices for the hotels. D, people renting out their apartments for short stays in Minnerton have been charging rates similar to hotel room rates. We do not know that. And E, the number of hotels operating in Minnerton has decreased over the past 3 years. We also don't know that. That could be happening, but something that could be happening is not an inference. Only something that is happening 100% of the time. So let's check our answer. Yes, if the demand stayed the same as it had been at a lower supply level and the supply increased, then overall demand would fall and prices would fall. We know that supply has increased, and we know that the prices have not changed. Therefore, overall demand must have increased. to keep up with the increase in supply. All right. Let's look at our next example. So this is a TTP medium, and the next one I believe is also a TTP medium, and then we'll do 4 that are hard level. So just FYI on that. Let's look at our next example, and I'll give you a couple minutes. All right, does anyone need another few seconds? Okay. Because of their high metabolism for the first weeks of their lives, baby hummingbirds, which cannot feed themselves, rely completely on their mothers to feed them every 15 minutes for the 14 consecutive hours of the day, during which they are awake and will starve to death within an hour of missing a feeding. However, when food is not available or when they deem necessary, adult hummingbirds can enter a torpid state of relatively low metabolism, decreasing their heart rates from 1,200 beats per minute to about 50 beats per minute. If the statements above are true, which of the following must also be true? Let's look at our breakdown. Baby hummingbirds are completely reliant on their mothers for the first few weeks of life because they must be fed every 15 minutes for 14 consecutive hours a day, and if they miss a feeding, they will starve to death within the hour. And fact 2, when food is not available or when they think it's necessary, adult hummingbirds can enter a torpid state that lowers their metabolic needs and decreases their heart rates from 1,200 beats per minute to about 50 beats per minute. These are 2 different facts, so if there was a conclusion to this argument, it would definitely need to tie them together, I think. But we're just looking for an inference. Let's see what we got. A birdwatcher watching a hummingbird nest during some newborn baby's 14 waking hours and claiming that they were crying because their mother had been away for hours would be incorrect. Yes, they would, because they will starve to death within the hour if they miss a feeding. So if their mother was gone for hours, they would not make it that long. B, if a baby hummingbird goes for over 15 minutes without a meal, it will enter a reduced metabolism torpid state in order to conserve precious energy until a meal arrives. This is expecting us to conflate the 2 facts. So that's one reason why it's good to just break them out from each other. C, Upon becoming more self-sufficient, a baby hummingbird will not find it necessary to utilize torpid states because its energetic needs can be met through hunting and feeding itself. This is almost a distortion, like it's a blend of two facts, and it distorts it a little bit because the baby hummingbirds aren't using torpid states at all, and when they are older, they probably will, if that's how the hummingbirds have evolved. So this one is totally wrong. D, when not in a torpid state, adult hummingbirds have caloric needs much greater than those of baby hummingbirds. This is not supported by the passage. I think this is supposed to be one that like might be true, but isn't actually true. But I think usually babies have higher caloric needs than adults because they have to go from being babies to adults, and that takes a lot of energy. And E, when she has babies, a mother hummingbird will spend most of her time in the nest watching over them to ensure that they are well cared for. So this is not fully supported by the passage, but it is very plausible as far as something that could be true. It is possible that these mother hummingbirds are dropping by like every 15 minutes for a couple of minutes to feed their babies and then flying away for 13 minutes. Does that sound so stressful? Yes, but it could be the case. And so since this one, even if it's probably true, isn't definitely true 100% of the time, it does not. So I'm thinking it's A. Yes, the birds would not be crying for hours because their mother was gone. They would have starved to death within the hour. Great. Let's look at one that's a bit more challenging. All right. In nuclear fusion, the nuclei of two atoms join to form a nucleus of a different element and, in the process, release energy that could be used to produce electrical energy. Generally, temperatures around 50 million degrees Celsius are needed to produce nuclear fusion, but such temperatures are extremely difficult to reach. Now, scientists are studying cold fusion, which could theoretically produce energy through nuclear fusion occurring at room temperature, helping to solve the world's energy-related problems. However, to date, no one has demonstrated that cold fusion can actually occur. If the statements above are true, which of the following must also be true? This is definitely one that has a bit of awkward phrasing in it. Let's look at our breakdown. Nuclear fusion is where the nuclei of two atoms join to form the nucleus of a different element and release energy that could be used to produce electrical energy. This generally requires temps of about 50 million degrees Celsius, but such temps are very difficult to reach. Cold fusion, which is what scientists are currently studying, could theoretically produce energy through nuclear fusion occurring at room temperature. However, no one has successfully demonstrated that cold fusion can actually occur yet. Let's look at our answers. A, fusion will not be a viable means of solving the world's energy-related problems in the near future. This is not fully supported. In fact, a lot of scientific developments don't happen in a linear fashion. It's very much breakthrough based. So something could easily happen that fixes the problem they're having and makes this a great solution. B, if temperatures of 50 million degrees Celsius are reached, nuclear fusion will occur. The prompt says that temperatures around 50 million degrees Celsius are needed to produce nuclear fusion, but not the only thing needed to produce it. So this one is saying that the second 50 million degrees Celsius is reached, nuclear fusion will occur, but there's probably more that goes into it than that. So this one isn't fully supported. C, if the nuclei of two atoms joined to form a nucleus of a different element, that process occurred in a situation characterized by temperatures around 50 million degrees Celsius. So this one's pretty tempting, but notice that the prompt says generally temperatures around 50 million degrees Celsius are needed to produce nuclear fusion. That implies that perhaps that's not always the case. And also, I think that this one relies a bit on a false binary assumption, which is to say, we are given these two situations. Nuclear fusion at 50 million degrees Celsius, or they're looking at cold fusion, which happens at room temperature. But there's actually a ton of temperatures between room temperature and 50 million degrees. So, and there's also temperatures above 50 million degrees. So it could be the case that this happened at a temperature of 60 million degrees because it was hot enough, but it was not in fact 50 million degrees or close to that. That's why C doesn't quite work. D, cold fusion cannot occur at temperature, that should be cannot. Cold fusion cannot occur at temperatures above room temperature. So again, that's kind of the binary trap as well, because I think that something could be defined at cold fusion as cold fusion and be happening at like, I don't know, 100 degrees Celsius. That's not room temperature, but it's definitely not 50 million degrees either. So it could still probably be relatively cold. Since we don't know for sure, D does not work. E, if in an experiment, energy from a nuclear reaction was used to produce electrical energy, cold fusion did not drive that process. So this one I like better, because when you do a scientific experiment and you're writing out your hypothesis, the trick to writing a hypothesis is that you have to write your hypothesis and then you have to write your null hypothesis, and they together have to encompass all potential like eventualities. And this one kind of works in that way. It's saying if an experiment happened and nuclear reaction was used to produce electrical energy, cold fusion did not drive that process. Well, we do know that no one has ever demonstrated that cold fusion can actually occur. It's not saying that it happened at 50 million degrees. It's just saying it wasn't cold fusion. And so based on the last sentence, this one is supported. Let's see. We have some question now. Is B out of proportion? You could say B is out of proportion, I think. It's assuming that, like, just because something is required, it is sufficient. Necessary versus sufficient. So if something is necessary, it's required for something to happen, but that doesn't mean it's the only thing that's required. Josh, I'm not 100% clear on what you're asking. If you want to rephrase a little bit, on C is also assuming that since we haven't found cold fusion to be true yet, it does not exist, right? It's not necessarily assuming that. It's because it's talking about the past. So C and E are kind of similar, but the problem with C is that it's assuming there's only two choices, 50 million degrees or cold fusion, and there might be other choices. And E is assuming there's only two choices, cold fusion or not cold fusion, and that is a better assumption. So if the nuclei of two atoms join to form a nucleus of a different element, that process occurred in a situation characterized by temperatures around 50 million degrees Celsius. If it said that process would occur in a situation characterized by temperatures around 50 million degrees Celsius, then it would in fact be questioning whether cold fusion could ever occur. In the paragraph, though, it's never mentioned that cold fusion can't produce electrical energy. Okay. So it doesn't say that outright, but it does say scientists are studying cold fusion, which could theoretically produce energy through nuclear fusion. And we know that from the first sentence, nuclear fusion releases energy that could be used to produce electrical energy. And that could theoretically solve the world's energy-related problems, but no one has ever demonstrated that cold fusion can actually occur. So I think that one's not too much of a stretch, because in the context of the problem, those steps are accounted for, I would say. I have an issue with E. If in an experiment, energy from a nuclear reaction was used to produce electrical energy, cold fusion did not drive that process. So that's a good question, Matzi. Here's the deal. The passage has to be encapsulated to a degree. And because we're not talking about fission, then fission cannot be a factor here. I do think that that is a fair note, but I think in the context of the argument, we would be able to overlook that because fission isn't brought up, and also because E is the only answer that we don't have a strong reason to discard. I know I say it a lot, but we're really looking for like the least bad choice when we're going through these. So if we have like a solid reason to discard every other answer, and then the last one is not as solid, then even if you don't love it, that might be the best one. Spicy question. I love some discourse. All right, yeah. Since cold fusion has yet to be successfully accomplished, then any experiment that used energy from a nuclear reaction to produce electrical energy was not driven by cold fusion. All right, next question. Give you a couple minutes. I'm going to give you guys a couple more seconds. All right. It is impossible to complete Marvel's course in wizardry without developing strong magical skills, and the wizardry exam tests magical skills. All the same, some people who have completed Marvel's course have not passed the wizardry exam. Furthermore, some people who have failed to complete Marvel's course have nevertheless passed the wizardry exam. Which of the following conclusions can most properly be drawn from the information above? Let's look at our breakdown. It's impossible to complete this course without developing strong magical skills. The wizardry exam tests magical skills. Some people who have completed Marvel's wizardry course have failed the wizardry exam. And some people who have failed to complete Marvel's course have passed the wizardry exam. There are two things I want to point out with this one. On fact 2, the wizardry exam tests magical skills. That doesn't mean that it's the only thing it tests. Like, the GMAT tests critical reasoning, but you can't expect to do well if the only thing that you're good at is critical reasoning. So it does not exclusively test magical skills, it just tests them. We don't know for sure, but that is something I noticed. And the other thing is, there are people who have completed this course and have failed the exam. Knowing the knowledge that a test is testing you on is not the only thing you need to pass an exam. There's also like test anxiety and stuff that can come up. And on this last one, some people who have failed to complete Marvel's course have passed the wizardry exam. This is probably not the only course that teaches these skills, and people learn different ways. So perhaps someone, people can fail courses, again, for any number of reasons. Perhaps they had something come up and they had to drop it. And then they went and did like a different course, or they self-studied. So those are some things I would notice with this one. Sometimes on the short examples, there's surprisingly a lot going on. Let's look through our answer choices. A. Sometimes people who take the wizardry exam become too anxious to pass the exam, even though they possess the magical skills necessary for doing so. So, this is why you have to be careful about pre-thinking, because while this is plausible, it is not fully supported by the argument. We do not know why people failed the exam. We just know that some people who pass the course and ostensibly have these skills that it's testing over have failed. B. It is possible to pass the wizardry exam without having magical skills as strong as those developed by people who complete Marvel's course in wizardry. So, say there are 2 teachers at your school and they both teach a subject, AP physics, or physics and AP physics. So someone that takes the regular physics class might still be able to pass the AP exam, but that doesn't mean that like the AP physics students don't develop better skills. So this one doesn't work because it says as strong as those developed by people who have completed Marvel's course in wizardry. As far as we know, the Marvel's course in wizardry is like the very bottom course that you could pass and still develop like the minimum required skills to pass this test. There could be way better courses out there that give you better skills. and you could still pass the test. We don't know where Marvel falls in the ranking of schools, and so this one doesn't work for that reason. Let's see. Oh, someone had a question. It's not a guarantee that people who completed the whole course could pass the test, right? Yes, it's not a guarantee. It would be wrong to believe a person being strongly skilled in magic to be a guarantee that that person will pass any test of a skill in magic. Guess what? It would be wrong, because we know that if these people are passing this course, they have strong magical skills. And we know that this exam tests magical skills, but we know that some people are passing this course and not passing the exam. So it would be wrong to believe that being strongly skilled in magic is a guarantee that the person will pass any test of a skill in magic, because some of these people that are strongly skilled in magic are failing the only test of magical skill that we are discussing. So I like that one. D, no matter how strong the magical skills a person develops are, those skills may fade if the person who has developed them does not use them regularly. This could be true, but it is irrelevant to our argument, and it is also not fully supported. And E, the magical skills tested by the wizardry exam and the magical skills developed through taking Marvel's course in wizardry are not the same skills. Well, again, not necessarily. There are more factors to passing a test than simply knowing the material on the test. Now I'm liking the, let's see. Yep. There is questions without developing strong magical skills, so it seems Marvel's course is strong. It does seem that Marvel's course is strong. I am sure that it is a strong skill, but in the case of B, we don't know that it is possible to pass the wizardry exam without having magical skills as strong as those developed by the people who complete the Marvels course, because the Marvels course is requiring people to develop strong magical skills in order to get through it, but they could also develop stronger magical skills in some other way and pass it. And for that reason, B is not fully supported, if that makes sense. Awesome. All right. Yep. Being skilled in magic is clearly not sufficient to pass the wizardry exam if some people who have completed the course that it's impossible to complete without gaining strong magical skills have then failed the exam. All right, next question. Okay, about 30 more seconds. Currently, the Bozelton subway system's expenses are 20% greater than its revenue. A rider on Bozelton subways pays the same fare regardless of the length of the ride taken. Consultants hired by the Bozelton Transit Authority have determined that if the fare for using the subways is reduced by 20%, Bozelton subway system will experience increased ridership such that the system will cover its current expenses. Which of the following can be properly inferred about the consultant's conclusions about the Bozelton subway? So, Bozelton subway system's expenses exceed its revenue by 20%. Subway riders pay the same fare regardless of the length of the ride. And consultants hired by the Bozelton Transit Authority have determined that a 20% reduction in fare prices will lead to increased ridership such that the subway system will cover its expenses. I picked this one because I had been very nitpicky about the math in the last couple of lessons, and I did not have a good example with like valid math. So here's what I would point out. We're talking about percents. Any answer that isn't talking about percents would not be a good answer. They do like to throw those in there. I don't think that this one has one that isn't talking about percents, but just if it says percent, you're talking percents. If it says increase, you're talking increase. So whatever the unit it's talking about is, make sure the units match. A, the consultants do not believe that there is any practical way for the Bozelton Transit Authority to reduce the expenses associated with operating the subway. That is not supported because there could be practical ways, and that's just not as easy as this. There could be other options, and they're recommending this one for whatever reason. Perhaps they recommended a practical way for them to reduce expenses, and the Bozelton Transit Authority was like, we're not doing that, give us something else. So A is not fully supported. B, the consultants expect the fare reduction to result in at least a 50% increase in use of the Bozelton subway system. Yeah, I think so. I had some math drawn out on a later slide, but yes, I believe so. C, the consultants predict that a 20% fare reduction would not result in crowding on the subways that would cause some people to reduce their use of the subway system. The consultants, hold on, what does it say about consultants? They're saying that if the fare for using the subways is reduced by 20%, then the subway system will experience increased ridership such that the system will cover its current expenses. So the consultants in C are not necessarily predicting that the fare reduction would not result in crowding on the subways that would cause some people to reduce their use of the subway system. That is not supported. They are only saying that overall ridership would increase such that the system would be able to cover its current expenses. D, the consultants do not believe that the subway system could cover its expenses by increasing rather than decreasing the fare. Again, we do not know this for sure. They absolutely could have even pitched an increase in fare, and the Bozelton Transit Authority might have been like, we're not doing that, find a different way. And so then they came in with this decrease in fare. If it's not 100% of the time, then it's not an inference that we can make. And E, the consultants have determined that reducing the fare for using the subway by less than 20% would result in the systems continuing to operate at a loss. Not necessarily. there could be other ways, and they could still do a reduction of 15%, and the criteria might just be higher as far as increased ridership or whatever they have brought in their like deck presentation. So notice on this one that A is not an inference we can make. C is not an inference that we could reasonably make. D is not an inference we can make. And E is also not an inference we can make. Most of these are based on the fact that or based on the assumption that these consultants brought one plan, like I found one possible way to do a thing, and typically that is not how it works. Now that we have ruled out those four, it doesn't hurt to run this math real quick just to make sure. But yes, 1.2 divided by 8 is 50%. So we just calculate the break even, pretty easy. You probably don't even need to do it if you're a bit more confident than I am, but I would go ahead and do it just to make sure that the answer I thought was the best still held. But yeah, you don't necessarily have to run calculations on every answer because most of them just don't hold up to a little bit of scrutiny. And so once in a while, though, you will have to do a little bit of math. All right, one last question. Give you a couple minutes. We'll do another 30 seconds. All right. Wildston Orchards produces and sells 3 kinds of fruit: apples, pears, and peaches. Last year, apple sales revenue was 10% greater than it was the year before last year. However, last year, the percentage of total revenue from sales of fruit represented by apple sales revenue was lower than the same percentage for the year before last year. Which of the following can be properly inferred about the fruit sales of Wildston Orchards from the statements above? Let's look here. So, Wildston Orchard sells 3 kinds of fruit: apples, peaches, and pears. Last year, apple sales revenue was 10% higher than it was the year before last. Also last year, apple sales revenue represented a lower percentage of total sales revenue than it did the year before last. If last year's pear sales revenue was 10% greater than the preceding years, then last year's peach sales revenue was more than 10% greater than the preceding years. So we know that the apple revenue went up 10%, but that the piece of the overall revenue it contributed to went down, which means that the other two had to go up by more than 10% overall. If last year's pear sales revenue was 10%, then in order for that to be true, then the peach sales revenue would have to be greater than 10%, so that they are averaging more than 10% of an increase if both of these facts about the apples are true. So I like A. B, apple sales revenue increased less than pear sales revenue and less than peach sales revenue increased from the year before last year to last year. We don't actually know this. We know that apple sales revenue increased less than the combined revenue from pear and peach sales, but the peach sales revenue could have gone down and the pear sales revenue could have just like exploded. So we don't know that it increased less than each individual category. We only know that it increased less than the combined amount of the other two fruits. If apple sales revenue had not increased, total revenue from fruit sales would have increased less than 10% from the year before last year to last year. We don't know this either. I mean, maybe they sell like 500 peaches a year for $1 each, and 500 pears a year for $1 each, and 10 apples a year for $1 each, because they have one apple tree in the whole orchard. And so they increased from 10 to 11. The total, if they didn't do that, it doesn't mean that the other two could not have increased more than 10% on their own. D, last year, apple sales revenue represented less than 1/3 of total revenue from fruit sales. We don't know that for sure either. We really don't know what the breakdown is because there's 3 prongs: the peaches, the pears, and the apples. If there was 2 prongs, there was a lot more of an inference that we could make. But because there is 3, the relationship between the other 2 is a lot less clear since we only have information about the apples. So D, not necessarily. And E, the year before last year, apple sales revenue increased from that of the year 2 years before last year more than total fruit sales revenue did. We definitely don't know anything about 2 years ago. So the year before last year. Yeah, that's out of scope in a time sense. So I'm thinking A. Let's see. Yeah, if the revenue from sales of apples increased 10%, but the proportion of total revenue it represents decreased, then the increase from the other 2 fruits combined must have increased more than 10% on average, like between the other 2. This choice says that if pear revenue increased by only 10%, then peach revenue must have increased by more than 10%, which is true. For pear plus peach revenue to increase by more than 10%, if pear increased by only 10%, then it's true that peach revenue growth must have been greater than 10%, if that makes sense. Andrew, do you want me to re-explain the right answer or one of the other answers? I'll just do the whole thing. Yep. Oh, right answer. Okay. I wish I had done a graph, but I did not. So, apples increased by 10%. So we know that they increased, but we also know that the overall percentage of revenue that they contributed is less. So in order for them to have increased 10%, the other 2 have to have increased by more than 10% thereby watering down the overall contribution to revenue that the apples have, even in their 110% new sales revenue. So that's why if it gives us in this answer that the pair sales revenue was 10% greater than the preceding years, the overall increase has to come from somewhere else in order for it to be true that the apples increased in sales revenue 10%, but decreased in the total percentage of revenue that they account for. And for that reason, we know that peach sales revenue would have to be more than 10%. Does that make sense? Is it fair for us to always eliminate answers where the units do not match the STEM? I hate to say anything is an always, because there might be like a wild card dance where you wouldn't do that. But I would say typically, Tyler, if the units don't match, that answer is going to have to do some very impressive things for it to be right. And especially if you're talking about like percent increases versus money, like dollar increases, then if you can't account for the translation between the two, like if it doesn't give you the percent in dollars or you can't calculate the percent in dollars, then the two cannot be interchanged because you just have no idea. So I would say, I hate to say always eliminate answers where the units don't match, but it's probably a pretty safe bet. Calculation for example 5. Oh, yes. Let me go back. So yeah, I can go through this. I kind of rushed through it. So if revenue is the old fare times the number of passengers and the expenses are 120% of that, then we know that the new revenue with the 20% decrease would be 80% of the old fare, so 0.8F, and times whatever modifier for the new passenger, because that's what we're going to solve for, and then the old passenger number times whatever modifier. So we know that 80% F times whatever new number of passengers must equate to the expenses, because they said that it would offset the current expenses. So 1.2 times FP, and then we can take out F and P and solve for Y. And so 0.8Y, 80% Y equals 1.2, so Y equals 1.5, 50% increase. Any other questions? That's our last example. So if you guys have any questions about any of the examples or any other questions at all, I'm here to help. Thank you, Joshua. If you tend to, what's the best piece of advice I can give before tackling a question to not get too ahead of yourself? If you tend to kind of rush ahead, sometimes, certainly for me, I will do that. And sometimes what helps is to have like some roadblocks. So I think that that's why when I started taking notes and doing the breakdowns like this, it really helped me because it made me slow down, and that way I wasn't missing stuff. So sometimes it's good to just like have some strategic roadblocks in order to stop you from like rushing through things and getting it yourself. But I would also just say, like, there are some very basic tenets of these questions that it can help to remind yourself of. And one of them is that they will provide you with all the answers or all the information that you need to get an answer, so you do not have to bring any external information. And two is that when we go through the question, like there will be some answer choices you can easily eliminate, but usually, depending on how hard it is, there will be like two that you might be debating between. One will be clearly better, which is to say better than the other one, not necessarily a great answer, but there will be a big gap between the two. So if you just remind yourself of that, then I think it can help center you on like, I got to focus on the question. I'm not bringing any external experience in. I'm just saying like, hey, everything I need is here. What can I do with the information provided? Andrew, is inference the hardest critical reasoning section? Also, I'm having a hard time differentiating between find the conclusion and inference question prompts. So, Andrew, they are super similar, and you are having a hard time differentiating because, like, they're almost the same thing. I wouldn't say inference is necessarily the hardest critical reading section because critical reasoning section, because it will depend on the person. Like some people just like method of reasoning, they cannot deal with it. It's just so difficult for them. And so I think it kind of depends on how your brain works. Some people are better at geometry and some people are better at algebra, like, so it's not necessarily like that it's going to be the hardest across the board, but it is very different than the assumptions-based questions. And so I think it's a bit of a hurdle to transition into these. And that's why they really designed the course to be like very assumptions focused up front, because that's most of the questions that you'll run into and you get to repeat these skills. And then sometimes when you get to like inference and find the conclusion, it's a bit jarring. The difference between find the conclusion questions and inference questions, the main one is that typically a find the conclusion question will be something that you can like tack on to the end of the argument. And an inference might not be that. So there's some of these for sure that are based on like parts of the answer. Like this hummingbird one. Let's see. Yeah. They're completely reliant on their mothers for the first few weeks because if they don't get a meal every 15 minutes, like they will die within the hour. That's the right answer is just that. It's based only on like this end part of this first fact. And that's kind of the main difference. But you don't need to worry too much about telling the difference in stems because a lot of like even these will use the word conclusion, which I think is a bit confusing. Because if there is the style of answers will be a little bit different. With the inferences, it must be true. So you know that you're looking for something that must be true. And if that is based on like a tiny part of the passage, but it must be true, great, you're good to go. Whereas a lot of times the find the conclusion answers are more broad, like they have to tie multiple premises together, and they don't necessarily have to do it as effectively, but you wouldn't write for this one, like, therefore a bird watcher watching a hummingbird nest during some newborn baby's 14 waking hours. You wouldn't like tack that onto the end because it's a very weird like summation conclusion. It's only based on part of one of these other facts. How did you use the GMAT club for critical reasoning after exhausting TTP questions? I want to avoid substandard non-GMAT-ish questions, passages. Okay, Nancy, here's the deal. On GMAT club, there are functionally like infinity questions to choose from. And the way that I ended up using it, I didn't have to figure this out until I started getting on, like after I was done with my tests and like doing my own answers for them. But I would just like, when I took my mocks and I had a question about something, I would search it, and all those are obviously like, they're all retired GMAT questions, so those are the only ones you're finding. But there is like a tag section, and it can be kind of tricky to get to, I think. But if you go in to a critical reasoning question and you click on, at the top, it'll have a couple of tags. It'll be like, oh, this is inference style, like this is strengthen the argument style, and then it will say the source, and then it will say typically like the level that it is ranked at, so 655 to 705 or whatever. And so if you go through and you get to the tags menu, you can sort by OG questions, official prep focus only. I don't think that you have to do focus only as much for the verbal section for critical reasoning, because there is critical reasoning. Don't do any sentence correction. You don't have to do those anymore. But like the critical reasoning questions, I think, are largely similar. On quant, I would be a little bit more worried about focus only, because they did change the style of questions a bit more on quant, and they're all kind of mixed together. But yeah, if you sort by OG questions for critical reasoning at various levels, then I would not be worried about substandard at all. You can get very familiar with exactly what you're going to run into on the GMAT. How does the inference question of critical reasoning differentiate, or is different from reading comprehension inference question? So they're not, and that's the secret. The difference in inference questions from critical reasoning or reading comprehension is the amount of reading that you have to do, like the amount of things that you have to poke holes in. So these are very brief, but you do kind of have to really get into the weeds with them. Reading comp is typically not as brief, but there's you don't have to be as like deep dive on every single sentence. So it's the same concept. It's just the amount of material and like how maybe diluted the overall ideas are over the body of text is a little bit different, but they are asking very similar things. And the same question for reading comp as well. I feel like if I don't do reading comp for 2 days, my level just dips. Did you face that? Yeah, and that's why definitely going through the lessons, I would mix in. I feel like if you do too much of something, like you get burnt out on it, that's annoying. If you don't do enough of something, like it feels like you fall off, that's annoying. It's just a very delicate balance. But there is the same deal, like you can sort the reading comp passages by retired GMAT passages, and those ones are nice because you can kind of like read the passage, you get all the questions, and then people do, like I do some breakdowns on GMAT Club as well for the reading comp. They're a little bit more labor intensive, so I have not got as many, but you can go through and kind of see, and they will rank the passage by level. So it might be like 705 to 805, but typically all of the questions in a hard reading comp passage aren't hard. Like some of them won't be as bad, and if one of them is just like way more difficult, then I think that they will rank it up a little bit higher, because the passage doesn't really determine how hard the questions are, and vice versa. Sometimes the questions are very hard, but the passage is very simple. Sometimes the questions are like, the passage is so dense, and you get to the questions, and it's like, what is like the second sentence of the second paragraph talk about? And you're like, oh, well, let me go read it. So I think that there are plenty that you can sort by like OG material on there. I would just probably do the OG material if you are on GMAT Club, because there's a lot of questions on there, and I don't think you'll run out of OG, and like that would just be a good practice to throw in, just because they are structured a little bit differently sometimes, and so that can help you apply things in a slightly more like test style question way. Inference could be stated as the main idea of the passage, right? So it's like squares and rectangles that like every square is a rectangle, but not every rectangle is a square. So an inference can be like the main idea of the passage, but not necessarily. But typically, like, even then though, the main idea of the passage, like, it should be fully supported by the passage, I would say, especially in reading comprehension. But every inference that you're looking for isn't necessarily going to encapsulate the whole passage. Did I break my day into reading comp, critical reasoning, and quant so I didn't over burn out? So sometimes I would do that. Sometimes I would do, I think it's really like, you don't want to like make excuses to avoid something if you don't like it. But otherwise, I think you do kind of just have to listen to your brain, because there are some days that it wanted me to do like verbal stuff that is just a lot more concept dense to me. It's a lot more like paragraph reading, and I was not feeling it. And I would do quant where there's way less words and it's more like active and you're writing more, and vice versa. Sometimes like I did not want to do calculations and I just wanted to like read stuff and be not more passive, but like, I guess more like physically passive and just kind of like percolate with the ideas instead of having to write down so much stuff. And so I think that sometimes just meeting yourself where you're at in those, you might get slightly more effective at studying, but you don't want to be like, oh, I never feel like reading comp passages, so I'm not going to do that, and then it's been 2 months and you never did. So I guess watch out for that a little bit, but I do think it's good to listen to yourself. And I do think that sometimes we like psych ourselves out. So on this, when I did this one, I had an inference like challenge test that I hadn't taken on here, and I wanted to get like a diverse number of questions, and so I took it and I got a perfect score. And I feel like I almost never got a perfect score on like a hard level challenge TPP test the first time that I took it when I was doing the classes, but just like having some space from studying all the time, I was like, oh, like I'm not so tense, like I'm able to see the components and not psych myself out so much. So sometimes it's like, if you have to mix it up a little bit just to keep your brain fresh, that's nice. But if you're really worried about like, oh, if I don't look at this every 3 days, I'm going to just forget everything about it. I have 100% felt that way, and it's also like probably not true. So sometimes you just gotta like rest and have a little faith in yourself. All right, any other questions? Okie doke. Thank you guys so much for coming. I think we're doing probably find the conclusion next week. So look out for that, and I will see you all next time. I appreciate you so much. Have a great week. Bye.